On my 30th birthday, my rich grandpa smiled. "Tom, how have you been spending your $3,400,000 trust fund?" I blinked, paralyzed. "What trust fund?" My parents went a horrifying shade of white. He turned to them, calm as ice, and asked, "Where did it go?" That question, asked with such devastating precision, cracked my life wide open. The fractures had been there for years. But that was the night my constructed reality finally gave way. I lived in Portland, in a third-floor walk up where the cracked window frame let in a perpetual draft and the pipes rattled constantly. It was cramped and outdated, but it was mine. That freedom, the sense that I was beholden to no one, was worth the faint smell of rust from the old radiator. This meager apartment was the one place my parents' curated perfection couldn't touch me. They, of course, lived a different reality in Lake Oswiggo, in a sprawling, three-story lakefront house designed to impress. Every interaction with them felt like a performance. They spoke in a constant monologue about charity galas, golf tournaments, and European cruises, casually weaving their status into every conversation while dismissing my efforts as a freelance graphic designer. They had taught me the lesson of self-reliance early. It builds character, they'd said when they refused to cover my college tuition or help with my student loans. I learned to survive on little, hitting impossible deadlines, just to keep my bank account above zero. The fragile stability I'd built finally shattered a few days before my birthday. I was putting the finishing touches on a logo revision for my biggest and only steady client, a mid-sized tech startup. An email arrived. They had gone bankrupt overnight. Every contract, including mine, was terminated. I stared at the short message until the words blurred. Opening my banking app confirmed the grim reality. I had just a few $100s left. It felt like standing on the edge of a great, black drop. I sat stunned in the gloom, realizing I could no longer patch the holes in my worn, thin life. Then my phone lit up. It was my mother. For a desperate moment, I hoped she might sense my stress. But her voice was sharp and cheerful, launching immediately into a reminder to dress appropriately for the birthday dinner in Seattle. When I managed to tell her I had lost my biggest source of income, she paused only for a beat. "Don't ruin the mood with negativity, Tom," she instructed, her voice already moving on. Then she hung up, leaving me alone in the dark. I listened to the wind push against the old window frame and felt a cold, widening hollow where connection should have been. I wondered how long I could endure this specific loneliness that only comes from the people who were supposed to know me best. Yet, spending my remaining savings on a bus ticket to Seattle was non-negotiable. My parents would never tolerate an excuse, especially not on my birthday. I knew I had to go. Spending my remaining savings on the bus ticket felt reckless, but avoiding the birthday dinner was non-negotiable. Watching strangers chat and laugh on the ride, I envied their seeming lightness, untouched by the constant pressure of proving their worth to people who never seemed to care about who they were beneath the surface. When I arrived at my parents' house in Lake Oswiggo, I immediately knew something was wrong. The house itself, usually a fortress of polished elegance, felt off balance, a brand new, deep gray luxury sedan that I had never seen before sat gleaming in the driveway. The expense of it was baffling given the market turmoil they often complained about. As I walked inside, the scent of an unfamiliar, sharp designer perfume, not my mother's signature scent, floated in the air. My parents met me with smiles that felt too practiced, too high wattage. Beneath their polished exterior, I sensed a tension, something tightly coiled. It wasn't the usual social stiffness. It was anxiety, perhaps even fear. My mother, Jane, fussed with the collar of my jacket, as if checking for imperfections, but her eyes kept darting toward the hallway. My father, Richard, usually distant and stoic, was suddenly overly warm, performing a rehearsed kindness that made my skin crawl. Nothing felt natural. I tried to ask my mother about the new car and the scent, but she dodged every question, redirecting the conversation to the dinner reservations. "We'll discuss the itinerary once we're in Seattle, dear," she said, cutting me off with a wave of her hand. Then came the first crack. As I passed the kitchen, drawn by the sound of ice shifting in a glass, I heard their voices, low but sharp, from the dining room. My mother's whisper was strained. "We can't tell him yet." My father's hissed reply sliced through the air. "We don't have a choice. We need the right moment, just not tonight." I froze where I stood. Before I could process the meaning of their words, they walked out and saw me. Their faces instantly snapped into those wide, rehearsed smiles, as if nothing had happened. They steered me toward the living room, talking quickly about some new interior design plans. The anxiety radiating from them, however, was impossible to ignore. They were hiding something enormous. Later, I managed to briefly video call Jasper Quinn, my old roommate, who had the unique talent of seeing the weight I carried even before I did. I mumbled that I was fine, but his gaze was knowing. He looked at me as if he could see the storm gathering behind my eyes, and I couldn't bear the sincerity. I hung up faster than I should have. Lunch with my parents the next day was no better. They spent the entire meal bragging about how much they had spent upgrading the house and the luxury vacation they had booked to Europe. My appetite shrank with every word when I gently brought up my job loss and asked if they could possibly cover part of next month's rent. A desperate, humiliating request. They refused instantly, almost indignantly. "You need to learn how to manage money like an adult, Tom," my mother said, echoing the old, familiar lecture. But as my father looked away, I caught a flicker of guilt, or perhaps a darker shade of fear, in his eyes. While clearing the table, a glint of light drew my attention to an open drawer by the china cabinet. Inside lay a manila folder with my name printed on the tab. I reached for it instinctively, but my mother swept in, a blur of practiced movement, and slammed the drawer shut just before my fingers made contact. Her smile was forced, her grip on my arm too tight as she guided me away, changing the subject with a practiced ease that was chilling. That was the moment the truth began to settle inside me. My life hadn't just been shaped by their expectations. It had been shaped by a massive secret they were keeping from me. Whatever they were so frantically hiding was waiting for me in Seattle. It was a missing piece of my entire financial life. I realized that my loneliness and my struggles were not merely a consequence of their cold philosophy, but an active product of their choices. I left the house and headed toward the dinner with a terrible heaviness in my chest, the kind that tells you the storm is coming long before the clouds appear. I arrived at the restaurant, canless, with a knot of dread tightening in my chest. Stepping inside, the first thing that struck me was the intense warmth of the room, a stark contrast to the late winter chill outside. Golden light draped across polished glassware, and the gentle, classic melody of a piano drifted through the air. Every table seemed to glow with the kind of effortless affluence that had been the backdrop of my entire life, yet a world away from my cramped apartment. I felt instantly like an imposter, a guest who had wandered into the wrong story. My parents were seated at a large, Prominent round table in the center of the main dining room, dressed in shades of impeccable elegance that matched the room too perfectly. They had clearly requested this table. Everything about their posture and carefully styled hair screamed, "Look at us! Look how well we are doing." When they saw me, their smiles were immediate, bright, and polite. "Tom, darling, you made it," my mother, Jane, chirped. My father, Richard, nodded curtly. There was no real warmth, and absolutely no hint that they recalled our fraught conversation from the night before, or my devastating news about the job loss. They didn't ask about my work, my finances, or the stress I'd been carrying for weeks. Instead, they asked if I had seen the new wine list, or whether the traffic from Portland had been bad. Their words skimmed across the surface of everything real, never sinking in. Dish after dish arrived, each one more elaborate and expensive than the last. Half-hearted toasts and compliments swirled around me. I tried to focus on the conversation, but inside, a widening hollow kept me separate from the celebration. My parents maintained their flawless posture, their sentences polished, their laughter perfectly curated. I wondered if anyone else in the restaurant could sense the tension humming beneath the tablecloth, the falseness of their smiles. Did anyone else see through the performance? We were halfway through the main course, discussing a recent charity gala I had zero interest in, when the atmosphere violently shifted. A staff member opened the heavy front door, and the room seemed to pause, the piano music fading slightly. My mother's hand jerked so sharply that she dropped her linen napkin onto the white carpet. My father rose halfway out of his chair, shoulders squared as if bracing for a physical impact. Their sudden, dramatic shift in demeanor was impossible to ignore. They exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated panic, their faces draining of color. Standing in the doorway was my grandfather, Augustus Hale. He did not rush. He was a man who never needed to hurry to command attention. He moved with the kind of slow, deliberate ease that came from decades of being the most powerful man in any room. He was the founder of Hale Dominion, the vast holding company that governed my family's wealth and Seattle's landscape. As soon as he reached our table, he wrapped his arms around me in a warm, steady hug. It was the first moment of genuine connection I'd felt all evening. I pulled back, surprised. "Grandpa, why didn't you tell me you were coming?" He smiled, a slight, knowing curve of his lips. "It's your 30th, Tom." I couldn't miss it. He seemed to enjoy the secrecy, but the shift in my parents was impossible to miss. They were exchanging terrified glances, the panic in their eyes suggesting his presence threatened something they were desperately trying to protect. My mother began fussing nervously with her diamond necklace. My father's knuckles were white where they gripped his water glass. They looked exactly like two people caught in a lie before anyone had even accused them. Augustus, oblivious or perhaps deliberately ignoring their fear, sat down. He waved off the waiter, who rushed over with a wine list and signaled for a fresh glass. The air grew heavy, almost anticipatory. Then came the moment that ripped my life in half. My grandfather lifted his glass. The sound of crystal tapping against the table was sharp in the silence. He looked straight at me, his gaze calm but absolute, almost chilling. His voice was steady and carried just enough weight to cut through the quiet hum of the room. "Tom, how have you been spending your $3,400,000 trust fund?" The words didn't make sense. They hung in the air, divorced from any reality I knew. My hands went instantly cold. I stared at him, my throat tightening until it felt closed. The only response I could manage was a dry whisper. What trust fund? I said. The entire dining room froze solid. My parents went a shocking, sick shade of pale. They looked like they might collapse into their chairs, the tension so extreme, I feared they might stop breathing. Their performance had failed, spectacularly. My grandfather didn't even blink. He set his glass down gently, the movement slow and deliberate, then turned his gaze from me to my parents. His voice was low, but it carried more weight than the walls around us. If he doesn't know, he said, fixing them with a cold stare. Then tell me, where did it go? The silence that followed stretched until something inside me, some last shred of illusion, finally cracked open. My mother stuttered, managing only a broken, breathy sound. My father swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the tablecloth. Their raw panic was so absolute, it made the entire restaurant fade into the background. I suddenly understood everything. Why they had been tense. Why their smiles had been forced. Why their eyes had darted everywhere but at me. They were hiding something enormous. Something that now had a staggering price tag. A moment later, Augustus signaled the staff. Within seconds, a waiter was moving quickly to prepare a private room in the back. My grandfather placed a heavy, steady hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from the collapsed spectacle of my parents. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked behind him, knowing without being told that every unanswered question in my life, every small financial struggle, every distant rejection, was about to demand its catastrophic explanation. And I had no idea how much those answers would cost me. The private room felt colder than the bustling dining hall. The walls were lined with frosted glass panels that reflected the overhead lighting in sharp, sterile angles. When the door clicked shut behind us, the sound carried a finality that made my stomach twist with dread. I found myself standing in a confrontation that had been building long before tonight, surrounded by my silent, pale parents, my imposing grandfather, his attorney Thatcher Cole, and his assistant Wynne. Augustus signaled for Thatcher and Wynne to begin. They moved with a chilling efficiency, like two agents executing a rehearsed, inevitable move. Wynne handed me a manila folder, identical to the one my mother had slammed shut in the kitchen, with my name printed across the top. The weight of it felt ominous and physical in my hands. Inside, I found a detailed record of a financial account I had never seen before. A trust fund. Mine. It had been established the year I was born by my grandfather to ensure my financial security regardless of my parents' management. My vision blurred slightly as I read the opening page. The initial capital, through careful investment over 3 decades, should have grown into a staggering sum more than $3 million. But then, I saw the current balance listed. $72,000. Everything else, every dollar that should have secured my future, was gone. Thatcher began to read out the transaction history. His voice was crisp and emotionless, reciting figures that felt like physical blows. Withdrawal dated June 20th, 2 years ago. Purpose: extensive home renovations at Lake Oswiggo property. My mind flashed to the expensive new marble countertops and the imported kitchen appliances my parents had bragged about. Withdrawal date December 5th, 18 months ago. Purpose: purchase of luxury vehicle. A deep gray sedan. I remembered the car I had just seen in the driveway, the one that had felt so unsettlingly new. Slept. Repeated transactions for international travel and luxury goods. He listed the European trips and the charity galas my parents had casually mentioned for years. Extravagant personal expenditures funded entirely by me. I looked up at my parents. My father, Richard, stared at the table, his face devoid of expression. but his shoulders were hunched in a posture of profound defeat. My mother, Jane, pressed her lips together, so tightly they disappeared, trying to hold herself together with sheer will. I searched their faces, desperate for a shred of remorse, a single word of explanation. But they wouldn't meet my gaze. Then Thatcher delivered the second devastating revelation. He paused, shuffling a few documents, and continued. The largest single withdrawal, totaling $750,000, was used to buy a secondary property, a beach house in Cannon Beach. He slid the deed across the table. The property was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. My name was not on the deed. Theirs was. They had used my trust fund to purchase a second home, securing their own comfort, and had never told me it existed. A wave of disbelief, so strong it was almost dizzying, washed over me. I had to grip the edge of the polished mahogany table to stay upright. When I finally found my voice, it sounded hollow and thin, echoing the emptiness inside me. Why? I asked, looking directly at my mother. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you take the money? My parents mumbled excuses simultaneously. Richard claimed they were only managing it for my future. Jane insisted they worried I would waste it due to my lack of financial experience. Their words were hollow, dissolving the last remnants of the illusions I'd held about them. This wasn't oversight. This wasn't protection. This was a calculating, cold-blooded betrayal. Augustus stepped forward, his presence filling the room. He nodded to Thatcher, who presented the full documentation. It showed clearly that my parents had claimed ownership of the funds for their own use, not just borrowed them. They had liquidated assets that were intended to be solely mine and transferred them into their names. Even then, my parents reached for excuses, insisting this was all done for my benefit, that they knew best. I stood there, listening to them justify years of deceit, and felt something crucial fracture inside me. The hurt wasn't about the number. Not entirely. It was the realization that they had fundamentally never believed I was capable of managing my own life. Or perhaps, simply, that they hadn't cared. Augustus's voice cut through the tension, hard and inescapable. He revealed that he had suspected foul play months ago. He had repeatedly asked them for complete financial transparency regarding the trust, and every time they had stalled, provided incomplete information, or simply lied. What was unfolding now was not a misunderstanding or a single mistake. It was a long, deliberate pattern of deceit. I stared at Jane and Richard. Everything strange I had noticed over the past few years. The tension, the sudden, expensive purchases, the secretive behavior. The way they had dismissed my struggles. It had all been pieces of a vast, underlying truth I hadn't been allowed to see. And now it was all laid bare in front of me, undeniable and ugly. Augustus closed the folder sharply and turned to me. His expression was calm, but immensely firm. The look of a man who knows the next step will change everything, irrevocably. There is something even more serious we need to address tonight, Tom, he said. My pulse quickened. I felt the ground shift again beneath my feet, sensing a deeper foundation of rot. I had thought the loss of the money was the climax, but I knew, with a sick certainty, this was only the beginning of the storm. I had thought the worst part was hearing the number. $72,000 left from a fund that should have secured my entire future. But as I stood there, staring at the closed folder on the table, I realized that number was only the doorway. The real blow came when Thatcher Cole placed another stack of documents in front of me, far thicker and heavier than the first, and said, "There is more Tom needs to see." The air in the private room grew thick and unmoving. My heartbeat became a dull, painful drumming inside my chest. Thatcher, methodical and precise, walked me through a series of bank statements and loan agreements tied directly to my name. Lines of credit I had never applied for. Secured loans backed by assets I didn't even know I owned. It was a dizzying picture of financial manipulation, carried out with frightening secrecy. My throat tightened when Thatcher paused over one specific file and quietly said, "This may be especially painful." It was the deed to a small piece of undeveloped land outside Tacoma. A forested plot my grandfather had gifted me when I was 13. I remembered that day clearly, standing beside Augustus, a much smaller boy, as he told me the land was something solid to lean on when I grew up. Something no one could ever take away. It was a promise, a tangible piece of stability. Yet, here it was, stamped and recorded as collateral on a massive loan my parents had taken out years ago. They had gambled with the very thing that was supposed to anchor me. Everything inside me twisted. Memories I had cherished. Holidays. Old conversations. Moments I thought were genuinely loving. Shifted under the weight of this new information. The betrayal didn't just come from the money. It came from the casual ease with which they had rewritten the meaning of everything my grandfather had given me. They hadn't just spent my future. They had mortgaged my past. Wynne stepped forward with another folder, this one thin and unsettling. She explained there had been repeated transfers from the trust account into an offshore account, registered under the name of someone my mother knew. A distant acquaintance. Barely connected to the family. Someone who should have had zero access to anything belonging to me. The implication was clear, calculated, and sickening. My parents weren't just careless overspenders. Driven by poor judgment, they were actively hiding money, concealing assets to prevent discovery or recovery. I looked at them. "Are you hiding money?" I asked directly. My voice was low but steady. My father, Richard, lowered his eyes, saying nothing. My mother, Jane, clasped her hands together, so tightly her knuckles turned white. Their silence was the loudest confirmation I could have received. Augustus reached into his briefcase and pulled out 2 airline tickets. The destination was Buenos Aires. The departure date was 2 days from now. One way. Their plan to run was laid bare. My breath stopped in my chest. They hadn't just managed my funds poorly. They hadn't just taken loans out in my name. They had planned to leave the country. They planned to run from everything they had done and leave me alone with the financial and legal fallout. I turned to them, shocked at how small my voice sounded when I finally asked, "Why?" They began to cry at the same time, their tears immediate and theatrical, their words tumbling out in fragmented sentences. "Protecting the family's reputation," Jane sobbed. "Preventing scandal," Richard pleaded. "Keeping everything from spiraling out of control." They spoke only about their image, their comfort, and their need to escape. I listened to their self-pitying justifications and felt the last, thin threads that connected us loosen completely. They hadn't thought about me. They hadn't thought about the wreckage they were leaving behind. They had only thought about themselves. Augustus stood silently for a long moment, watching them. When he spoke, his voice was grave. He revealed that this wasn't their first financial crisis. They had been overspending for years, living far beyond even the immense income they controlled, scrambling to fill gaps by using whatever was available, including the trust fund, and including me. It wasn't a single mistake, it was a sustained, selfish pattern. I looked at my parents then, and I understood something painful and undeniable. I had lost them long before tonight. I just hadn't known it. The people I thought were my guardians had been actively using and diminishing my life for their own benefit for 3 decades. Augustus sat down, folding his hands on the table. He told me calmly that every document in the room, every bank statement, every deed, I could be in court by morning if that was my decision. He wouldn't push me either way. But he wanted me to understand that whatever choice I made now would irrevocably change the path of every life in this family. I stared at the thick piles of paperwork in front of me. My name on documents I had never signed. My future rerouted without my knowledge. 2 people who had put their shallow comfort above everything else, including their own son. My hands trembled slightly as I closed the folder. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what they wanted or what society expected. I was thinking only about what I needed: truth and self-preservation. The room faded into a blur. The decision was now mine and mine alone. The path forward would define whether I remained a victim or chose survival. Everything depended on the choice I made next. 3 days passed before I could sleep more than an hour at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chaos scattered across the restaurant table, the one-way airline tickets glinting under the cold light, and my parents' faces shifting from aggressive denial to raw desperation. When the summons came to meet at the Hale Dominion headquarters, I felt something inside me harden into cold resolve. This was no longer a conversation about family. It was a reckoning. The headquarters towered over Seattle, all gleaming steel and mirrored glass reflecting the gray winter sky. I rode the elevator to the top floor, the ascent matching the speed of my thudding pulse. When the doors opened, I saw them immediately. My parents were already seated at the massive, polished conference table. They looked dramatically different, smaller somehow. My father's shoulders slumped, his once immaculate jacket rumpled. My mother's eyes were rimmed red, and her composure was fractured. They didn't greet me. They barely looked at me, avoiding my gaze with a shame that was almost palpable. Augustus sat at the head of the table, his hands folded, his gaze steady and unwavering as I walked in. He simply asked me to sit. I did, feeling the immense weight of every single financial document, every lie, and every distant birthday that had led to this room. My parents spoke first, almost in unison, their voices trembling with manufactured sincerity. They were sorry, they said. So deeply sorry. They hadn't meant for any of this to happen. It had gotten away from them. They would repay the money in small installments. They only needed time, a little grace, a chance to make things right. Their voices broke just enough to sound genuine to anyone who didn't know the full context. But before I could even begin to process their plea, Thatcher Cole, the attorney, placed new documents on the table. They were records of recent, covert attempts to move asset statements, efforts that directly contradicted the claims my parents had just made. The timelines did not match their narrative of innocent mistake. Their story crumbled instantly under the weight of the evidence. I pushed back from the table slightly. I told them, my voice surprisingly steady, that I needed to think. I wasn't ready to decide anything yet. The truth was, their performance had sickened me. The desperation was only about salvaging their lifestyle, not about making amends to me. That was when my father, Richard, seemed to snap. The fear and shame he had been holding back erupted as vicious deflection. His voice sharpened, hardening into the old, familiar contempt he used to mask his own failures. If you had just been more successful, Tom, he snapped, his eyes finally meeting mine, cold and accusing. Huh. If you had shown more ambition, worked harder, done anything more than that pathetic freelance work, we wouldn't have felt pressured to dip into the trust. You left it sitting there, unused. It's your lack of achievement that forced this. The words hit harder than any number on any financial statement. It was the final, vicious insult, confirming they had stopped seeing me as a person long ago. In their minds, they were the victims, forced into criminality by my failure. Even now, they needed to make their crime my failure. Augustus stood abruptly, ignoring their protests, his heightened presence commanding immediate silence. He announced, his voice carrying the authority of final judgment, that all assets derived from the trust were being placed back under my name, effective immediately. The properties they had so proudly possessed, the beach house in Cannon Beach and the Lake Oswiggo mansion, were already under temporary court order. The room went completely silent. My mother, Jane, covered her face, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Tears for the loss of their status, not for me. My father stared at Augustus, his face a mask of impotent anger that had nowhere to go. They were losing the only identity they had ever known. Then Thatcher read the official notice. Both houses would be seized until further hearings. Bank accounts tied to the fraud were frozen, and all financial activity was being monitored. Hearing the judgment spoken aloud made everything sickeningly real. My parents were about to lose the status and identity they had built their lives upon. Augustus looked at me again. He asked what I wanted to do next. Whether I chose to pursue legal action and criminal charges or walk away with the recovered assets, he said he would honor it. But the decision, he reiterated, had to come from me, from a place of self-interest, not obligation. I stared at the two people who had raised me. People who had shaped me through silence, through pressure, and through impossible expectations. They had made their comfort my responsibility, and their mistakes my burden. And I realized that I no longer feared disappointing them. I no longer needed their approval. What I needed, urgently and completely, was to protect myself from the two of them. I closed my eyes for a brief second, took a steadying breath, and opened them. I looked straight at my father, who still held that look of self-righteous blame, and at my mother, whose tears were clearly for the lost luxury, not the broken relationship. I told my grandfather to move forward with everything. Take it to court, I said. I want the full legal process to proceed. My mother's breath hitched, a thin, strangled sound. My father muttered something incoherent under his breath. But he didn't stand. He didn't fight. The exhaustion and the evidence had finally overwhelmed their bravado. Thatcher slid the final documents across the table. These were not indictments, but acknowledgments that an investigation was proceeding, and that they understood the terms of the asset seizure. Their hands shook noticeably as they wrote their names. With each stroke of their pen, the emotional distance between us widened, becoming a canyon too vast to cross. When it was finally over, I pushed my chair back and stepped out of the conference room. The air outside the room felt clean and cool, hitting me like a new season. I didn't know what waited on the other side of this decision, but I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to the way things were. I had chosen myself, and the choice felt like a terrifying liberation. The morning of the preliminary hearing felt unreal. I woke up in my new South Lake Union apartment. Sunlight stretching quietly across the wide living room floor. For a moment, I didn't recognize where I was. After years of squeezing through narrow hallways and living with the relentless drone of old pipes, the stillness here almost felt like a mistake, as if I were occupying a life that didn't belong to me. I stood for a while at the window, staring at Lake Union's muted shimmer, trying to settle the profound unease in my chest. When I stepped outside, the sharp chill in the air did nothing to steady my nerves. As I approached the King County Courthouse, I saw reporters clustered on the steps, their microphones raised like hungry snakes, their cameras pointed like sharpened lenses. The Hale family's scandal had made its way into the public record, and the press wasted no time turning it into a devastating headline. Seeing my last name, Hale, flashed on their clipboards made something inside me twist. This was no longer just our family's secret unraveling. It was a very public humiliation. Inside, I saw my parents waiting with their new team of defense attorneys. My father, Richard, usually immaculate to the point of obsession, looked disheveled. His hair was unkempt, his tie loose, and his eyes bloodshot. My mother, Jane, was a sickly gray color, and her posture, once so rigidly disciplined, was slumped in utter exhaustion. I felt a brief, painful flicker of pity despite everything they had done. They weren't the towering, powerful figures of my childhood anymore. They were simply two people watching their world cave in around them. Before the hearing began, I met, briefly, with Augustus and the court-appointed lawyers handling the recovery of the trust funds. They informed me that my parents' new legal team planned that I had known about the trust fund all along and had simply neglected to manage it properly. They intended to claim that I had somehow contributed to the financial discrepancies through neglect. I stared at the attorneys in stunned disbelief. Even now, when the walls were collapsing around them, my parents still found a way to make me the shield that absorbed the impact. It was astonishing how deeply that instinct ran in them, to use me, to blame me, to deflect responsibility. When we entered the courtroom, the judge began by asking each party to summarize what had happened to the trust over the last several years. My parents' attorneys painted a picture of temporary borrowing, of parental concern, and of protecting their son from impulsive financial decisions. They made the theft sound almost noble, almost generous, arguing that they only ever had my future in mind. But hearing those words, knowing the truth, knowing the lies and the planned escape, made something so arise in my throat. Then Thatcher Cole stood. His voice was crisp, professional, and entirely unwavering. He placed new, verified evidence before the court records showing transfers from the trust into an undisclosed account in Nevada, one connected to a shell company, not registered under either of my parents' names. This was not temporary borrowing, Thatcher stated clearly to the judge. This was clear, deliberate concealment. It was not a mistake, Your Honor. It was intentional misdirection. I remembered my father teaching me to tie a full Windsor. Not for a childhood piano recital, his hands gentle. Now those same hands were shaking as he signed documents to destroy his family. The contrast was devastating. My father sank back into his chair as if punched. My mother pressed her fingers to her forehead, as though trying to stop the room from spinning out of control. Watching them break should have made me feel something. Fear. Guilt. Obligation. But I felt strangely numb. The exhaustion had bled those complex feelings away, leaving only a hard, protective core where my heart used to be. The prosecutor then turned to me, offering a direct proposal. If I agreed to testify fully, cooperating completely with the investigation, the case could move swiftly. All remaining assets, rightfully belonging to me, would be restored without further dispute. The implication hung heavily in the quiet room. My full cooperation would almost certainly send my parents to prison for fraud and embezzlement. My heartbeat fluttered painfully. I plept. I had never imagined being placed in a position where choosing justice meant actively handing my own parents over to the consequences they had earned. But then, the memories poured in, the late nights wondering why nothing in my life ever felt stable, the years of scraping by alone, their contempt disguised as encouragement, their dismissal of every struggle I had faced. The lies, the manipulation, the cold, selfish calculation. Before I could speak, my father, Richard, stood abruptly. He couldn't handle the pressure. He had to save himself. His voice cracked with panic as he declared, "I acted under my wife's direction. She orchestrated everything. She insisted, she persuaded. She pushed me into it." My mother's face collapsed. She stared at him as if he were a stranger, a complete unknown. And for the first time, the facade of their united, polished front fell apart completely. They weren't protecting each other anymore. They were scrambling for individual survival, willing to sacrifice the person next to them, to save their own skin. The judge called for order, as their attorneys tried frantically to contain the chaos. I rose slowly, my knees trembling slightly, but my voice, when it came, was steady and clean. "I will cooperate fully with the court," I told the judge. I looked out over the courtroom, past the stunned faces of my parents. I want the truth acknowledged, and the law to follow its course, no matter where it leads. A quiet settled over the room, heavy but resolute. My decision was final. By the end of the session, the judge approved the seizure of all relevant assets, pending trial, and moved the case to the next phase. My parents looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, like I had become a stranger, someone they couldn't reach or manipulate anymore. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look away. When I left the courthouse, I felt utterly exhausted, drained down to the bone. But I also felt taller, as though some invisible weight I had carried since childhood, the weight of their secrets and their shame, had finally loosened its grip and fallen away. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the case progressed quickly. Every asset tied to the trust fund was frozen, then reclaimed. The Lake Oswiggo house, once the symbol of my parents' pride and status, was seized. Their accounts were locked. Investigators uncovered more loans, more discrepancies, and more attempts to hide spending. With each revelation, the picture sharpened. This was not just mismanagement. It was a long-standing, calculated disregard for consequences. Then came another discovery. An apartment in downtown Seattle, purchased using the trust fund and registered under the name of a distant relative. I had no memory of this person ever being part of my life. Yet, their signature appeared on almost every relevant document. When the court ruled the property belonged to me, I held the deed in my hands and felt a strange mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Every asset returned to me was proof of another layer of deception. Before the final trial, I drove down to Tacoma to see my parents at the drab motel where they were staying. The room smelled of stale air and damp carpet. My father, Richard, didn't lift his eyes when I walked in. My mother, Jane, looked at me as though she still expected to negotiate something, a final, favorable settlement. She asked if I could retract my testimony, even though she knew the trial was already too far along. When I finally stood to leave, my father spoke for the first time. It wasn't to apologize, or even to express regret. It was to ask if I could help cover their remaining attorney fees. The request cut deeper than anything they had done with the money. Even now, stripped of their wealth and facing ruin, they still saw me purely as a resource, Not as a son. They still felt entitled to my financial support. I looked at them both, small and broken in that cheap room. I told them quietly that I hoped they would learn what they needed to from all of this. Then I turned and walked away, without looking back. That was the last time I saw them. Life in South Lake Union slowly took shape after that. My freelance work began to grow, thanks in part to referrals from companies connected to my grandfather, Augustus. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was just surviving, I was living. I could breathe without waiting for something to collapse beneath me. One evening, my grandfather invited me for dinner in his vast, quiet office on the top floor of the Dominion Tower. The city glowed behind him, a distant, magnificent tapestry. He told me he had established a new trust. This time, he said, I would be the only one with access, the only manager, the only decision-maker. He'd watched me fight through years of hardship, and he wanted me to build something for myself now, unshadowed by anyone else's mistakes. I told him that what I wanted most wasn't wealth. I was the feeling of having someone who stayed. Grandpa, I said. He placed a hand on my shoulder, firm and steady. Tom, he said, sometimes family isn't the people who raise you, but the people who choose to stand beside you when everything falls apart. As I left Hale Dominion that night, my phone buzzed. It was Jasper, practically shouting with excitement. A major Seattle design firm had seen my recent portfolio work and wanted to partner long-term. A new professional chapter was opening, just as the old one finally settled into silence. That night, I stood on my balcony, overlooking Lake Union. The water was calm, the city breathing slowly below me. I thought of the boy I had been. The boy who never felt enough, who carried weight that wasn't his, who kept waiting for his parents to see him. I whispered into the cool air that this wasn't a victory over my parents. It was a victory over the version of myself who thought he had no power. I hadn't just reclaimed what was mine. I had reclaimed myself. I was finally free from their debt and from their definition of me. Survival had shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore. I finally had the chance to build a life based on choice, not damage. Choosing myself, truly choosing myself, was the bravest, most defining action of my life.